Welcome to our second lecture. My name is Bill, and we're going to cover section 2 from chapter 1. So starting right off the bat here, we're jumping right into some economics of the environment. And one of the biggest things we need to understand about economics is what GDP is. And you see the definition here. GDP is the market value in current dollars of all goods and services produced within a country for use during a current year. You're also going to see the term per capita GDP. Per capita simply means per person. So they take the total GDP and divide it by the population to find what the average gross domestic product each person produces. GDP is a really good measurement of the wealth of a country. And the higher the GDP, the more affluent the country is, the more things they can purchase, and the more stuff they have. GNP is gross national product. It's very similar to GDP, but this is the market value in dollars of all goods and services produced by a country. The difference there is that GDP is produced within the country. GNP can be produced outside of the country. So if you were a citizen of the United States, but you were working overseas, that would be included in the gross national product. Same thing if there was a U.S.-based company that had factories in China, for example, and a lot of our goods say made in China and distributed by a United States country, that would be factored in GNP. We've got two different types of countries in the world. The first one we're going to talk about is the developed nations. The developed nations are a small percentage of the world's population. So roughly 1.2 billion people live in developed countries. That's about 20% of Earth's population. These countries are highly industrialized. They've got the majority of the wealth and the income. We use up most of the resources, and we generate most of the waste. And the countries that are in this portion would be the United States, Canada, Japan, most of Europe, Australia, are all developed countries. In these developed countries, we've got that higher affluence. We've got a very high per capita GDP, which means we can focus on things like healthcare. And typically developed countries have a higher age expectancy or a higher life expectancy, meaning you live longer because we've got more resources we can dedicate to a better healthcare system. We also get to focus on things like education, luxuries like owning a car, having an iPad, and we also can focus on culture, like building museums and attending musical concerts or watching people paint. So there's a lot of stuff, physical things, physical items associated with developed nations. We've got the resources and the income to afford a lot of these things that are luxuries and not really necessities. On the other side of the coin, we've got the developing countries, and these, as you can see, make up the majority of the population. So roughly 80% of the people live in developing countries. These countries are not as industrialized, and they have a very small portion of the world's wealth and income, and they use up a small amount of the world's resources. Typically, you're thinking Africa with developing countries, but Asia and Latin America have their share of developing countries as well. These countries have really, really high populations, and these people that live there don't live on a lot of money. Their GDP per capita in these developing countries is awfully low. There'll be a figure later that has some numbers on it, but you're talking about people that live an entire year on less than $1,000. Which would be unthinkable in a country like the United States, but is commonplace in some African countries. Because they have such low income and low resources, the primary focus on the daily life for these people in developing countries is really survival and fulfilling their basic needs like water and food and shelter, things that we often take for granted living in a developed country. All right, this map is going to just show you where these countries are located. It's a little dated of a map with a 1998 date on it, but you can see just how low of an income, what our GNP per capita is, less than $1,000 a year in this sub-Saharan Africa and throughout Asia here. where your high income is over $10,000. Um, Even by today's standard, $10,000 wouldn't be a lot to live on for a year, but that's a factor of 10 higher than these low income developing countries. This graph here shows the global outlook, and it kind of compares our developing and developed countries. So you can see that population is extremely uneven, and this is really environmentally bad because you end up having a group of people that have things and a group of people that have not, or they don't have those things. And it can cause a lot of political tensions too, where you have some people thinking that life's not very fair when they see what's going on the other side of the fence. A big problem with such a large population being in the developing world is that really high population growth. So not only is that a really high number of people that live there, but it's also growing very rapidly. And if you remember that J-shaped curve of population growth, this is what we're currently seeing in the developing countries, shooting up very, very rapidly. And that's due to this 1.5% population growth. On the other side, all the wealth and income being in the developed countries leads to a lot of resources being used, and subsequently a lot of resources being thrown away. So we live in a very disposable society. I was down at the Buck Center earlier today for lunch, and I got myself a cup to drink my drink in, and now that I'm finished drinking the drink, I'm going to throw it away. So it's a very disposable society. What I could have done is I could have brought down my reusable bottle and use it several days in a row, and I would be able to use the resources, drink my Coca-Cola for lunch, and not generate the pollution or waste. Think about something like a cell phone, right? The cell phone companies design these phones to last about the length of your contract with AT&T or Verizon. And once the contract is up, oftentimes your cell phone's going to break down. And when it breaks down, what do you do with it? You pitch it out and throw it away and buy a new one. So we live in a very one-time use disposal economy where we buy new things, throw them out to get the next version, and so on and so forth. So on both sides of the coin, you've got really environmentally unfriendly scenarios. In the developed world, we have so many resources and we use them up so rapidly, we generate a lot of waste, whereas the developing world has so many people and such a fast rate of population growth that while they don't use up the amount of resources per person, they're still generating a lot of problems, destroying a lot of environment to house those people or to scrape by with the resources they can get their hands on. This graph here kind of shows our income disparities, and you can see that over time, our disparities gap between our high income and our lower incomes is growing. And this graph doesn't show all the way up to today, but you can see just how much of a difference there's been in the last 50 years in our income per person in $1980. And so this causes, like I said, a lot of environmental problems because you end up having the haves and have-nots, but also a lot of political problems where the countries that are these high-income countries have this really burning desire to acquire more and more stuff. And as those countries run out of domestic resources, minerals to mine, oil to drill and pump, they end up starting to look at these other lower income countries, and oftentimes they take advantage of them in order to acquire these resources at a very discounted price. And that causes a lot of political tensions, which are not good. Poverty versus affluence in the environment. So on the first hand here, we've got our resources and what type we use and what amount we use. And these are really important to consider on which side of the coin you're lying. If you're a developing country or a developed country, you're going to use very different resources. You're going to use a very different amount of them. For example, when we're talking about heating or cooling our house here in Jacksonville, we're burning coal over at the JEA plant, and they're sending electricity to us, which runs our heat pump and keeps our home temperate. If you're looking at somewhere like Africa or one of these developing countries, they're probably out there collecting fuel wood in order to heat their homes or to cook their food. So very different resources based on where the country is located and whether they are suffering from poverty or if they have the affluence to afford those resources. The next type is food, water, and housing quality. So these also vary very differently between our developing and developed world. Here in the developed world, we have really high quality food, really high quality water, and housing. We don't have to worry too much about the food we're eating being spoiled or where we're going to get our next meal. I was able to take maybe 300 steps to get down to the Buck Center and pick out whatever I wanted to eat. Drinking water is even more common right here where I'm at. I've got a water fountain right outside my classroom that 24 hours a day is ready to pump out good, clean water, and I don't have to worry about getting sick while drinking it. On top of that, our housing quality is really good. We get to use stronger materials, steel, concrete, really high quality lumber to build our houses with. None of these things are true for the developing world, where they might spend their entire day gathering food or water and build their houses out of the trees they can fell nearby. And then on top of that, they have to worry about the quality. The water quality might be contaminated with human waste or with pollution or something like that, where it's not good water, but it's all they can get. Family life can also be very different. So typically in affluent societies, our families are going to be very small. And if you look at your own family, you may have a few siblings, but chances are it does not exceed 3 or 4. If you look at a developing country where the more children the family has, the more people they have to help gather the food, the water, and the fuel they need to survive on a daily life, the easier it is for them. So they end up having very large families, like 8, 9, 10, or more children, which is why they have such rapid population growth. The daily tasks and objectives in a poverty-stricken area or a developing country, the daily task might be to survive. Your whole goal for the day might be to collect enough water so you can make it to the next day, or to collect enough food or fuel wood. Where here, we've got to motivate ourselves to get up and out of bed and get to work or get to school so we can make money to buy ourselves an iPod or to get ourselves the next model of car we're trying to buy. Education is also really different here. And you guys are very lucky, and some people kind of take it for granted, but education is a way of life in an affluent society, and it's really highly regarded and seen almost as a necessary thing, especially as we get further and further into the 2000s. Going to college is becoming the new graduating high school. In order to get a paying job, you almost need a college degree, where the education in these developing countries is going to be extremely different. It's not your typical type of schooling. It might be how to extract water from a certain type of plant root, or it might be how to locate food or meat to hunt, or maybe really rudimentary farming techniques. So the education varies extremely differently based on which part of the world you're in. And then the last one is the environmental impact. So I mentioned this earlier. On one hand, our affluent societies have a low number of people in the population, but a really high impact because those people are using and consuming so many resources and then creating so much waste. Where our developing countries have a lot of people, each one of those people is not using a lot of stuff, but there are so many of them, it is so destructive to the environment with habitat degradation around them. This IPAT, this is from the book. I don't think it's super important for the actual AP exam, but I do want to mention it because I'll put it on the test just in case it does appear. Essentially what we've got here is we have the different groups I was talking about. We have our affluent down here, and I'll just put an A for affluence, and we've got our poverty-stricken people up here. And so our developing countries that are in poverty have a really high number of people. You can see the big family, while they don't use a lot of resources or have a really big impact of the resource used. So they end up with this size environmental impact. On the other hand, in our affluent or our consumption societies, we have a small family, but they use up a lot of resources and generate a lot of waste. And so you end up with a really equivalent impact. It's not really mattering whether they're affluent or poverty stricken. They each have some negatives that lead to a large impact. Something that's really helpful for looking at these impacts is a ecological footprint. And this is a lab we're going to be doing in class. And by the time you watch this video, we actually might have already done it. But I'm going to assume that we haven't. An ecological footprint is to see how much of the world's resources you individually use. And then we can use that to multiply it by the population of the world, and it can tell us how many planets we would need to support the world's population if they all lived by our individual lifestyle. So this can be pretty eye-opening for some people when they look at this. And it factors in a couple different things that are tough to do and things that we don't really think about. For example, it factors in the energy required to produce a lot of the stuff we need. So it looks at how many times a week you eat meat, and we oftentimes don't pay the full environmental cost for that meat, meaning we're not paying for the amount of runoff from the animal waste at the farm and the amount of methane gas that the cows emit while they are growing before they become hamburgers for us. So it factors in the energy generated by our resources that we use daily, and it factors in the pollution that we generate by using those resources. I consider myself to be fairly environmentally conscious. I mean, I carry around my reusable water bottle. I fill it at the water fountain all the time. I drive a very small truck that's just enough to do what I need to do with it. But my ecological footprint comes out to be somewhere between 4.5 and 5 planets, which means that if everybody on Earth lived my lifestyle, we would need to have 4 to 5 planet Earths in order to support every one of those people. So hopefully your results are a little eye-opening, and the website can suggest a few changes to your lifestyle which can help reduce that ecological footprint. I do like to point out down here the differences between the per capita footprint and the total footprint. So if you look at the per capita footprint, that would be the average footprint per person in the country. And you can see just how massive the United States is, right? 10.9 hectares of land per person in the United States. Compare that to Netherlands. Netherlands, they live a little bit more environmentally friendly. They may have a stronger recycling program there. They may have not quite the consumption marketplace, the buy it and pitch it away economics that we practice here. And then on the bottom end of that spectrum, you have India, which is very, very small footprint per person because that's a very developing country. So they don't have a lot of resources for people. On the other side, we've got our total footprint for those countries. So India, even though they have a very small per person footprint, ends up with a very large footprint compared to the Netherlands. And the reason is they've got that huge population. So United States and Netherlands are about equivalent in GDP, meaning economically we're about the same, but we far exceed them because our population is much larger than them. Pollution, there are 2 main types of pollution. We've got natural pollution and anthropogenic pollution. Natural is things like volcanoes. We can't do too much to control them. Anthropogenic, anytime you see this, it means human generated. Anthro being human, genic meaning generated. And so those are our activities that generate pollution. We've got 2 types of them, point sources and non-point source. A point source is something where you can see the pollution appearing, such as these smokestacks right here would be a point source. We can see it smoking out of them. Or this pipe draining out. That is a point source. A non-point source would be like a farmer's field and the nitrates that run off of that. You can't really see where exactly they're coming from, and so we can't pinpoint that bit of pollution. The real big solution to pollution are the 3 R's: refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. So these R's focus on getting rid of generating it in the first place. Cleaning up is very temporary. It's also extremely expensive. If you think about the BP oil spill and how much money BP had to pay in order to remove the oil from the Gulf of Mexico. And it's not a good strategy because all of the life forms that were affected by that oil spill have already suffered from it. If we were able to prevent it, maybe by refusing the Gulf of Mexico oil or not allowing them to drill there, or if we were able to reduce, maybe if we had developed more economically friendly cars 20 years ago where we were using less oil, we wouldn't have drilled there in the first place. So this is a really good way of tackling the pollution problem. Cleanup is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a skinned knee. It's not the best way to fix the problem. If you wore a knee pad, and you always wore knee pads, then you probably wouldn't have skinned it in the first place, and you would have saved yourself that pain. Tragedy of commons is another really important concept. This is an article written in 1968 by a biologist, Garrett Hardin, and it's essentially the overuse of a common property. And that could be a couple different things. This picture here shows all these fish caught by these 6 individuals that presumably went on a charter fishing boat. And there's no way that these people are going to be able to eat all these fish. So they're essentially exploiting a common property, which would be the fish. Nobody really owns them or polices them or controls them. They're out there for anybody to use. And the thought process behind it is if I don't catch them and eat them or keep them, then somebody else will. So it doesn't really matter if I'm doing it, because if I don't, someone else is going to do it. A lot of this comes back with littering too. Why do people litter? Well, it's just one little piece and I'm just one little person. What's the big deal? When you have 7 billion people doing that one little piece, it adds up really rapidly. And I think this is where we're going to stop for this lecture. I'm sorry I went a little longer today, but please bring any questions you have to class tomorrow and we will discuss. Thank you for watching.